Wife cheated with the resort photographer during our $50,000 honeymoon in Bora Bora, and I found explicit photos on a USB drive and immediately kicked her out of our villa. I married Carol 3 months ago and we planned this massive honeymoon to Bora Bora that cost me $50,000 because my parents said I should spare no expense for the woman I love, and they were helping pay for it anyway since they own a successful business and they wanted their only son to have the best honeymoon possible. We stayed at the Four Seasons Resort Bora Bora in one of those overwater bungalows that everyone sees in magazines, and Carol was obsessed with getting the perfect photos for her social media accounts because she has always been really into photography and documenting every moment of our relationship. The resort had this professional photographer named Antoine who was French and probably in his early 30s, and he offered couples photography sessions for an additional fee, and Carol immediately wanted to book multiple sessions because she said our wedding photos were nice but she wanted something more artistic and romantic with the ocean backdrop. I thought it was a waste of money since we already had plenty of photos from our wedding, but Carol kept insisting and she said it would be something we could treasure forever and show our future children, so I agreed to book 3 different photo sessions over our 10-day stay. Antoine was very friendly and professional during our first session, and he took photos of us on the beach and around the resort, and he had this expensive camera equipment and these fancy lenses, and he knew exactly how to position us for the best lighting and angles. Carol was really impressed with his work and she kept asking him technical questions about photography and camera settings, and he seemed happy to explain everything to her, and he even offered to teach her some advanced techniques if she was interested in learning more. During our second photo session 2 days later, Antoine suggested that Carol might want some solo portraits while I went snorkeling because he said the lighting was perfect that afternoon and he could capture some really stunning shots of her in her dress against the sunset. I didn't think much of it and I was excited to go snorkeling anyway, so I left them alone for about 2 hours while I explored the coral reef near our villa. When I came back from snorkeling, Carol seemed really happy and excited, and she said Antoine had taken some amazing photos and she couldn't wait to see them when he finished editing everything. She seemed different somehow, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was, and I just assumed she was happy about the photos and maybe a little sunburn from being outside for so long. The third photo session was supposed to be our last one, and it was scheduled for the morning before we left Bora Bora, and Antoine said he would bring us a USB drive with all the edited photos from our 3 sessions. When he arrived at our villa that morning, he seemed nervous and he kept checking his camera bag, and he handed me the USB drive and said all our photos were on there and he hoped we would be happy with his work. After Antoine left, I plugged the USB drive into my laptop to look at our photos, and I was expecting to see beautiful couple shots and Carol's solo portraits, but instead I found a folder with our regular photos and then another folder that was labeled with just random letters and numbers. I clicked on that folder and immediately saw explicit photos of Carol completely naked in sexual positions, and she was clearly posing for the camera and looking directly at Antoine while he took the pictures, and there were also photos of them together where you could see his hands on her body and her mouth on his penis and other acts that I don't want to describe in detail. There were dozens of these photos and they were clearly taken during that second photo session when I went snorkeling, and I could tell by the lighting in the background that they were taken in different locations around the resort, including what looked like Antoine's room or office. The photos showed that this wasn't just a quick moment of weakness but a planned sexual encounter that lasted for a significant amount of time and involved multiple positions and acts. I immediately confronted Carol and I showed her the laptop screen and I demanded an explanation, and she turned completely white and started crying and saying it wasn't what it looked like and that Antoine had pressured her and she didn't know how those photos got on the USB drive. I told her to stop lying because the photos clearly showed her willingly participating and enjoying herself, and there was no way this happened without her full consent and planning. Carol then changed her story and said she had been attracted to Antoine and that things just happened naturally, and she said it didn't mean anything and she still loved me and wanted to make our marriage work. I told her that was complete bullshit and that she had cheated on me during our honeymoon just 3 days after we got married and that there was no coming back from something like this. I immediately called the front desk and told them I needed Carol moved to a different room and that I was extending my stay but she needed to be out of our villa within the hour. Carol started screaming and saying I couldn't just abandon her in a foreign country and that we needed to talk this through like adults, but I told her that she should have thought about that before she decided to fuck our photographer while I was snorkeling. The resort staff was very professional and they quickly arranged for Carol to be moved to a standard room on the other side of the property, and they sent someone to help her pack her belongings. Carol kept trying to argue with me and saying I was overreacting and that we could work through this, but I refused to listen to any more of her excuses, and I told her that our marriage was over and she needed to figure out her own way home. I spent the rest of my time in Bora Bora alone, and I actually ended up enjoying myself more than I had when Carol was there because I didn't have to deal with her constant need for photos and social media posts, and I could just relax and appreciate the beautiful location. I also used the time to document everything that had happened, and I made copies of all the photos and I started researching divorce lawyers back home. Update 1. I got the photographer fired and exposed his pattern of targeting married female guests, and it turns out my wife wasn't his first victim. After I got back home from Bora Bora, I couldn't stop thinking about Antoine and how professional and smooth he had been during our first photo session, and how he had specifically suggested that Carol do solo portraits while I went snorkeling. The whole thing felt too calculated and practiced for this to be the first time something like this had happened, and I decided I needed to contact the resort and report what had occurred. I called the Four Seasons Resort Bora Bora and asked to speak with the general manager, and I explained the entire situation, and I sent them copies of the explicit photos that Antoine had accidentally included on our USB drive. The general manager was horrified and said they took these matters very seriously and that they would conduct a full investigation immediately. Within 2 days the general manager called me back and said that they had terminated Antoine's employment immediately and that their investigation had revealed a pattern of inappropriate behavior with female guests. Apparently other couples had complained about Antoine in the past, but the complaints were usually vague and the resort hadn't been able to prove anything concrete until I provided the photographic evidence. The general manager told me that they had reviewed Antoine's work computer and found photos of several other women in compromising positions, and they had identified at least 4 other incidents over the past year where married women had been photographed in explicit situations during solo portrait sessions. The resort was now contacting all of these couples to inform them of what had happened and to offer counseling services and compensation. It turns out that Antoine had been working as a freelance photographer for the resort for almost 3 years, and he had developed this system where he would identify couples where the wife seemed interested in photography, and then he would gradually build rapport with her during the first session before suggesting solo portraits during the second session. He would then use his professional authority and the romantic setting to seduce these women and photograph the encounters as some kind of trophy collection. The resort also discovered that Antoine had been selling some of these photos online through various adult websites, and he had made thousands of dollars from exploiting these women who had trusted him as a professional photographer. The general manager said they were cooperating with local law enforcement and that Antoine would likely face criminal charges for his actions. I felt vindicated that my instincts had been correct and that this wasn't just a random affair but part of a calculated pattern of predatory behavior. The resort offered me a full refund for our honeymoon and additional compensation for the trauma, and they also said they were implementing new policies to prevent this kind of situation from happening again, including requiring chaperones for all solo photography sessions. Carol had been texting me constantly since I kicked her out of our villa, and she kept saying that she was sorry and that Antoine had manipulated her and that she was just one of his victims. I told her that I didn't care if Antoine was a predator because she still made the choice to cheat on me, and she could have said no at any point during their encounter, but instead she chose to pose for explicit photos and perform sexual acts with another man just days after our wedding. Carol also kept saying that I should feel sorry for her because she had been taken advantage of, but I pointed out that the photos clearly showed her enjoying herself and actively participating, and that she hadn't seemed upset or traumatized when she came back from the photo session, but instead she had seemed happy and excited about the experience. I hired a divorce lawyer as soon as I got back home, and I provided him with copies of all the photos and documentation from the resort, and he said this was one of the clearest cases of adultery he had ever seen and that Carol would have no legal standing to claim any assets or alimony. He also said that the photos would serve as ironclad evidence in divorce proceedings and that we could probably get the divorce finalized very quickly. Carol moved back in with her parents after I kicked her out, and she kept calling and emailing trying to convince me to give her another chance, but I had already changed all the locks on our house and I had frozen all our joint accounts so she couldn't access any money. My lawyer advised me to cut off all contact with Carol except through legal channels, so I blocked her number and all her social media accounts. Update 2. My cheating ex-wife is now stalking me at the resort and telling her parents I abandoned her overseas, and I showed her father the explicit photos and cut off all her access to my family's money. I decided to go back to Bora Bora for another week because the resort had given me a full refund and additional compensation, and I figured I might as well enjoy the vacation that I had paid for without having to deal with Carol's drama. I also wanted to have some time alone to think about my future and to put some distance between myself and all the legal proceedings that were starting back home. The resort upgraded me to an even nicer villa, and the staff was incredibly apologetic and accommodating, and they made sure I had everything I needed for a relaxing stay. I was actually having a great time swimming and reading and exploring the island, and I felt like I was finally able to appreciate Bora Bora the way it was meant to be appreciated without worrying about constant photo shoots and social media posts. On my third day back at the resort, I was having lunch at one of the beachside restaurants when I saw Carol walking across the lobby, and I couldn't believe she had followed me back to Bora Bora. She saw me at the same time and she immediately started walking toward my table, and she looked upset and desperate, and I could tell she had been crying. Carol sat down at my table without being invited, and she started talking rapidly and saying that she had used her savings to buy another plane ticket back to Bora Bora because she needed to talk to me in person and convince me to give our marriage another chance. She said she had been staying at a cheap hotel on the main island and taking the ferry to the resort every day hoping to find me. I told Carol that she was insane for following me halfway around the world and that nothing she could say would change my mind about the divorce, and that she needed to leave me alone and go back home. Carol started crying and saying that she loved me and that Antoine had manipulated her and that she would do anything to make things right between us. I told Carol that I didn't want to hear any more of her excuses and that she had made her choice when she decided to cheat on me during our honeymoon and that there were no second chances for something like this. Carol then got angry and started yelling that I was being unreasonable and that I should be supporting her because she was a victim of Antoine's predatory behavior. The restaurant staff was starting to notice our argument and other guests were looking at us, so I told Carol that if she didn't leave immediately I would call resort security and have her banned from the property. Carol said she wasn't going anywhere until I agreed to talk to her properly, and she said she would wait for me at the resort every day until I changed my mind. Over the next few days Carol kept showing up at different locations around the resort and she would try to approach me whenever she saw me, but I would immediately walk away or call resort security. The staff was very helpful and they started keeping an eye out for Carol and they would escort her off the property whenever she became disruptive. Carol also started calling her parents constantly and telling them that I had abandoned her in a foreign country and that I was being cruel and unreasonable and that they needed to convince me to take her back. Her father called me several times and he kept saying that I needed to be more understanding and that Carol was going through a difficult time and that marriages required forgiveness and compromise. I finally got fed up with Carol's father lecturing me about marriage and forgiveness, so I decided to show him exactly what his daughter had done during our honeymoon. I emailed him several of the explicit photos that Antoine had taken of Carol and I told him that this was what his daughter chose to do just 3 days after our wedding while I was snorkeling. Carol's father called me back within an hour and he was completely silent for a long time, and then he said he had no idea that the situation was this serious and that he understood why I wanted a divorce. He also said he was ashamed of Carol's behavior and that he wouldn't be contacting me again to try to convince me to reconcile with her. Carol's mother also called me later that day and she was crying and apologizing for not understanding the full situation, and she said that she and her husband would be telling Carol that she needed to come home immediately and stop harassing me. She also said that they were cutting off Carol's credit cards and financial support because they couldn't support her behavior after seeing the evidence of what she had done. The next day Carol showed up at my villa looking desperate and angry, and she started pounding on my door and screaming that I had ruined her life by showing the photos to her parents and that I had turned her own family against her. I called resort security immediately and they arrived within minutes and escorted Carol off the property and told her that she would be arrested if she returned. I later found out that Carol's parents had indeed cut off all her financial support and they had demanded that she come home immediately and that they were no longer willing to help her pay for hotels or flights or legal fees. Carol was apparently stuck at her cheap hotel with no money and no way to extend her stay in Bora Bora. I finished the rest of my vacation in peace and I actually had an amazing time exploring the island and enjoying all the activities that Carol had never been interested in because she was too focused on getting photos. I felt like I was finally free from all the drama and manipulation, and I was looking forward to starting my new life as a single man. Final update: divorce is finalized and my ex-wife got absolutely nothing because all assets were in my parents' names and she had zero legal claim due to her infidelity. The divorce proceedings moved very quickly once I provided my lawyer with all the photographic evidence and documentation from the resort, and Carol's lawyer basically advised her to accept whatever terms I offered because she had no legal standing to fight the adultery charges. Carol tried to claim that she deserved half of our assets and alimony because we had been married for 3 months, but my lawyer pointed out that all of our major assets, including our house and cars, were technically owned by my parents' business and that Carol had no legal claim to any of it. My parents had structured everything this way for tax purposes when they helped me buy our house and cars, and it turned out to be the perfect protection against Carol trying to take anything in the divorce. The only things that were actually in my name were some personal belongings and a small checking account, and Carol couldn't claim any of it anyway because of her adultery. Carol also tried to argue that she deserved compensation for emotional trauma and that I had been abusive by abandoning her in Bora Bora and cutting off her access to money, but my lawyer easily destroyed these arguments by pointing out that she had cheated on me during our honeymoon and that I had every right to end our marriage immediately. The photos also clearly showed that Carol had been a willing participant in the affair and that there was no evidence of coercion or manipulation. The judge was clearly disgusted by Carol's behavior and he made several comments during the proceedings about how adultery during a honeymoon was particularly egregious and showed a complete lack of respect for the marriage contract. He also noted that Carol had shown no real remorse for her actions and had instead tried to blame everyone else for the consequences of her choices. Carol ended up getting absolutely nothing from the divorce except for some personal belongings that she had brought into the marriage, and she was also responsible for paying her own legal fees. My lawyer said it was one of the most one-sided divorce settlements he had ever seen and that Carol's lawyer had basically given up trying to get her anything after seeing the photographic evidence. I also found out that Carol had been fired from her job while she was in Bora Bora because she had used up all her vacation time and then disappeared for an additional week without permission when she was stalking me at the resort. Her employer apparently had no patience for her personal drama affecting her work performance and they terminated her employment immediately. Carol moved back in with her parents permanently, and I heard through mutual friends that she was having a very difficult time finding new employment because her former employer wasn't giving her good references and she had no money to support herself. Her parents were apparently still angry about the photos I had shown them, and they were only providing her with basic food and shelter while demanding that she find a job and start taking responsibility for her life. I also received an update from the Four Seasons Resort about the criminal case against Antoine, and they said he had been arrested and charged with multiple counts of sexual exploitation and fraud for selling the photos online. Several of the other women whose photos he had taken were also pressing charges, and it looked like he would be facing significant prison time and financial penalties. The resort implemented new policies requiring background checks for all freelance photographers and mandatory chaperones for any solo photography sessions, and they also created a victim support fund to provide counseling and compensation for anyone who had been exploited by Antoine. They sent me a letter thanking me for bringing the situation to their attention and saying that my actions had probably prevented other women from being victimized. I ended up selling the house that Carol and I had lived in because I didn't want any reminders of our marriage, and I bought a smaller place that was entirely in my name and reflected my actual taste and preferences. I also started dating again, and I found that being single was actually much more enjoyable than being married to someone who was constantly focused on social media and appearances. Carol tried to contact me several times after the divorce was finalized, and she kept saying that she had learned from her mistakes and that she wanted another chance, but I never responded to any of her messages. My lawyer had advised me to keep all communication going through legal channels and to document any attempts at contact in case Carol's behavior escalated to harassment. I also heard that Carol had tried to contact some of our mutual friends to get them to convince me to give her another chance, but most of them had already heard about what happened during our honeymoon and they weren't interested in getting involved in her drama. Several people told me that they had always thought Carol was self-centered and attention-seeking, but they hadn't wanted to say anything while we were married. Looking back on everything, I'm grateful that I discovered Carol's true character so early in our marriage instead of wasting years with someone who was capable of cheating during our honeymoon. The whole experience taught me to trust my instincts and to never ignore red flags even when someone seems perfect on the surface. I'm also glad that I was able to expose Antoine's predatory behavior and prevent him from victimizing other women at the resort. I'm now completely free from all the legal and financial entanglements of my marriage to Carol, and I'm enjoying my new life as a single man with no drama or complications. I still travel frequently and I've been back to several tropical destinations, but I always book my own accommodations and I never hire resort photographers for anything. The experience in Bora Bora taught me that sometimes the most beautiful places can hide the ugliest betrayals, but that doesn't mean you should stop exploring the world.